April 11th, 1945, 8 miles off the coast of Okinawa. The destroyer USS KIDD cuts through choppy Pacific waters, steam pouring from her stacks as radar operators scan the horizon for incoming threats. Japanese kamikaze pilots have been swarming American vessels for days. The morning sun beats down on the metal decks, already scorching hot despite the early hour. The smell of salt, fuel oil, and steel hangs in the humid air as sailors move with practiced efficiency across the pitching deck of the 376-foot warship. Lieutenant Commander Harry Moore stands on the bridge, squinting against the harsh sunlight, sweat beading on his forehead in the suffocating tropical heat. His ship, nicknamed the Pirate of the Pacific, flies the Jolly Roger flag from its mast, the only American vessel authorized to do so. Moore's fingers trace the worn edges of a photograph in his breast pocket, his wife and infant son back in San Diego, whom he hasn't seen in 14 months. The radio crackles with terse reports from other picket ships stationed around the massive American fleet. 3 destroyers have already been hit in the past 48 hours. The tension across the bridge is palpable, like electricity before a lightning strike. "Bogies incoming!" "Bearing 270, a voice suddenly crackles through the loudspeaker. "Multiple aircraft, low altitude, high speed." Moore's jaw tightens as his heart pounds against his ribs. The familiar surge of adrenaline floods his system, but his voice remains steady. "All hands to battle stations," he orders, with practiced calm that belies the racing of his pulse. Air defense teams at the ready. This is not a drill. The piercing wail of the general quarters alarm echoes throughout the ship. Men drop whatever they're doing and sprint to their stations with choreographed precision born from countless drills. Gun crews race to their positions, ammunition handlers form human chains, and damage control teams stand ready with fire hoses and emergency equipment. Below decks, in a small compartment rarely found on destroyers, 19-year-old Seaman Walter Hayes works frantically, not at a gun or ammunition locker, but at the controls of a gleaming ice cream machine. The steady hum of the refrigeration unit provides an incongruous soundtrack to the chaos erupting around him. His hands move with practiced speed as he scoops the fresh vanilla batch into insulated containers. "Get that secured and get topside, Hayes," calls his division leader, Chief Petty Officer Frank Merrill, his voice tight with urgency. "This ain't no time for dessert. We've got company coming." Hayes nods, his young face suddenly serious. He slams the freezer door shut, securing the precious cargo, not ammunition, not medical supplies, but gallons of vanilla ice cream that had been promised to the men coming off the overnight watch. The cold metal of the machine contrasts sharply with the sweltering heat of the compartment as sweat drips down his back. "All secure, Chief," Hayes shouts over the blaring alarm, his Oklahoma accent still thick despite months at sea. As he races to his battle station at one of the 20mm anti-aircraft guns on the port side, Hayes feels the ship heeling hard to starboard, an evasive maneuver. The deck vibrates beneath his feet as the KIDD's engines push to flank speed. Through the open hatches, he can hear the rhythmic thump of the 5-inch guns tracking targets. The acrid smell of cordite already fills the air. High above, the first kamikaze plane screams towards the KIDD, its pilot on a one-way mission of sacrifice. American gunners fill the sky with a web of tracer fire, but the Japanese pilot flies through it with suicidal determination. The aircraft, a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter loaded with explosives, plunges toward the destroyer in a near-vertical dive. The suicide aircraft slams into the ship's hull amidships with a thunderous explosion that rocks the entire vessel. Metal tears like paper as aviation fuel ignites in a blinding fireball. The concussion knocks sailors off their feet throughout the ship. In an instant, 38 sailors perish in the inferno, and 55 others suffer horrific burns and shrapnel wounds. Screams of the injured mix with shouted orders as damage control teams rush to contain the spreading fires. As black smoke billows from the wounded destroyer, other kamikaze planes circle like vultures, seeking to finish off the stricken vessel. The remaining gun crews, faces blackened with smoke and grim with determination, continue firing in defiance at the Japanese aircraft. No one on the 21st Destroyer Division knew that the very machine Hayes had been operating just moments before, a luxury ice cream maker that Japanese commanders considered an extravagance beyond comprehension, would become symbolic of America's industrial might. A symbol so powerful that when Japanese intelligence discovered the purpose of this equipment on a mere destroyer, it would crack the resolve of commanders who could barely supply their own men with rice and clean drinking water. The story of the USS KIDD is not just of battles won through firepower or tactics, but of how America's ability to provide comfort and normalcy, even ice cream, in the midst of the most destructive war in human history, would become a psychological weapon more devastating than any bomb. It is a tale of how something as simple as a frozen dessert could undermine an enemy's will to fight more effectively than the most sophisticated weapon. Walter Hayes was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1926, the second son of a petroleum engineer and a schoolteacher. His childhood unfolded during the depths of the Great Depression, where luxuries were few and work was scarce. The Hayes family lived in a modest two-bedroom home on the outskirts of town, the white paint peeling from its clapboard siding as the drought years wore on. Walter's father, James, had once worked for a prosperous oil company, but found himself taking odd jobs as the economy collapsed, often returning home with hands cracked and bleeding from manual labor he'd never been trained to do. Even in those lean times when dinner was sometimes nothing more than potato soup and day-old bread, young Walter's favorite memory was the rare Sunday afternoon when his father would take the family to Woolworth's for 5-cent ice cream cones, a simple pleasure that stood out amidst years of sacrifice. Walter would stare into the glass-topped freezer case, mesmerized by the gleaming metal containers of vanilla, chocolate, and occasionally strawberry ice cream, before making his selection with the solemnity of a much weightier decision. My daddy would count pennies all week just so we could have that treat, Hayes would later recall in letters home to his mother. He said it wasn't just about the ice cream, but about remembering that hard times don't last forever. Even when he only had one thin dime in his pocket, he'd split an ice cream between my brother and me, never taking any for himself. Said watching us enjoy it was sweeter than any dessert. Those early experiences formed the foundation of Walter's character, an appreciation for simple pleasures and an understanding that small comforts could sustain the human spirit through difficult times. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the crucible of war that awaited him. By 1941, the Hayes family's fortunes had improved somewhat, as defense industries began ramping up in anticipation of America's potential entry into the war raging in Europe and Asia. Walter's father found steady work again at an oil refinery deemed essential to national defense, bringing stability back to the household. Walter, then 15, was a sophomore at East Tulsa High School, where he excelled in mathematics and showed a natural aptitude for mechanical systems in shop class. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything. Walter, like millions of other Americans, was stunned by the radio reports of the surprise attack. He vividly remembered his father sitting silently by the radio that evening, pipe smoke creating lazy circles in the air as President Roosevelt's voice declared that December 7th was a date which will live in infamy. Within days, recruitment posters appeared throughout Tulsa. Young men lined up at enlistment offices, eager to join the fight. Walter's older brother, Thomas, enlisted in the Army immediately, shipping out for basic training by Christmas. Walter, too young to join, watched with a mixture of pride and envy as his brother left in his crisp new uniform, their mother's tears dampening the wool as she embraced her eldest son one last time. For the next year and a half, Walter completed his schoolwork with distracted impatience. The war consumed everyone's attention. Rationing became a way of life. Gold stars began appearing in neighborhood windows, and Walter's shop class was converted to focus on skills that could support the war effort. He became particularly adept at repairing engines, spending hours after school working on decommissioned aircraft engines that had been donated for training purposes. At 17, in the spring of 1943, Walter convinced his reluctant parents to sign the papers allowing him to enlist in the Navy before his 18th birthday. His mother cried for 3 days, having already seen Thomas deployed to North Africa with Patton's forces. His father, though pained at the prospect of his youngest son going to war, understood the boy's determination. "If you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to know your own mind," James Hayes told his son the night before he left for boot camp. "Just remember that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs doing even when you're terrified." Walter's mechanical aptitude earned him high marks during initial training at Great Lakes Naval Station outside Chicago, where he endured the rigors of boot camp during the sweltering Midwestern summer of 1943. The 16-week training transformed the lanky Oklahoma teenager into a disciplined sailor, his frame filling out from the physical demands and his skin bronzed from endless hours of drill under the summer sun. His technical scores and mechanical background led to his placement in the engineering track, and by early 1944, after additional specialized training, he found himself assigned to the USS KIDD, a Fletcher-class destroyer barely a year old. The massive Brooklyn Navy Yard overwhelmed the Oklahoma boy, who had never seen buildings taller than 5 stories before joining the Navy. Now he stood dwarfed by cranes that could lift entire gun turrets and dry docks that could hold ships weighing thousands of tons. Walter's first glimpse of the KIDD left him breathless. The sleek, deadly lines of the destroyer spoke of speed and power that his rural upbringing had never prepared him for. At 376 feet long, with 5 5-inch guns and a complement of over 300 men, the KIDD represented American industrial might in steel form. Little did Hayes know that his assignment would not be to the massive engines that propelled the warship through the waves, but to a much smaller piece of equipment that would, in its own way, help win the war. "Got my orders today," he wrote home in a letter postmarked February 12, 1944. "I'm assigned to auxiliary systems on the USS KIDD. She's a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the newest in the fleet. They say we're heading to the Pacific soon. Don't worry about me, Mom. These ships are fast and well armed. The Japanese won't know what hit them." The KIDD had been commissioned on April 23, 1943, at the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney, New Jersey. She was named after Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd Sr., who had died on the bridge of the USS Arizona during the Pearl Harbor attack, the first American flag officer killed in World War II. The ship was sponsored by Admiral Kidd's widow, Inez Kidd, who had christened the vessel with the traditional champagne bottle and tearfully presented a leather-bound guest book to the wardroom officers with an inscription that read, "May the destiny of the USS KIDD be glorious. May her victories be triumphant and conclusive." The ship's first commanding officer, Commander Allen Roby, was a veteran naval officer with a reputation for both strict discipline and an unorthodox approach to leadership. During the KIDD's shakedown cruise in the Atlantic, Roby had allowed, some said encouraged, a peculiar tradition to develop. The crew, noting that their ship shared a name with the infamous 18th-century Scottish privateer Captain William Kidd, adopted a piratical theme. They painted a swashbuckling pirate figure on the ship's forward smokestack and, in an act that raised eyebrows throughout the fleet, hoisted the Jolly Roger skull and crossbones flag as they sailed into New York Harbor. When questioned about this breach of naval protocol, Commander Roby allegedly responded, "My men fight better when they've got some swagger. Besides, we're named after a kid, aren't we? Might as well embrace it." The brass at the Navy Department initially ordered the flag removed, but Admiral Ernest King, the no-nonsense chief of naval operations, reportedly countermanded the order after reviewing the KIDD's performance reports. "If they fight as well as they talk," King supposedly remarked, "let them keep their damned pirate flag." From the moment of her commissioning, the KIDD developed a reputation for pushing boundaries. During her initial cruise to the Brooklyn Naval Shipyard, she crossed New York Harbor flying the Jolly Roger from her foremast, a daring act that caught the attention of superior officers but was ultimately permitted as a morale-boosting tradition. Civilian tugboat operators and ferry passengers stared in disbelief at the sight of an American warship flying what appeared to be a pirate flag alongside the Stars and Stripes. The KIDD completed her shakedown cruise in the waters off Maine, where her crew endured brutal North Atlantic conditions while learning to operate their new vessel as a cohesive unit. Ice formed on the decks and superstructure during these exercises, requiring sailors to chip it away with hammers and axes to prevent the ship from becoming top-heavy. Gun crews practiced target shooting with numb fingers, and damage control teams ran drills in flooded compartments where the water temperature hovered just above freezing. By August 1943, the KIDD had been assigned to escort duty in the Atlantic, protecting convoys against German U-boat attacks. The monotonous zigzagging pattern of convoy protection was interrupted only by occasional submarine alerts, most of which proved false. The tedium of these patrols was balanced by the knowledge that they were keeping vital supply lines open to beleaguered Britain and the Soviet Union. In September, the KIDD received new orders. She was to transit the Panama Canal and join the burgeoning American fleet in the Pacific. The crew's excitement at finally heading to the active combat theater was tempered by the knowledge that Japanese forces, while retreating, remained formidable and fanatically dedicated. The KIDD's passage through the Panama Canal in late September was itself memorable. Steaming through the narrow waterway, with just feet to spare on either side of the ship's hull, the crew marveled at the engineering marvel of the locks and the lush jungle that pressed in from both shores. Monkeys chattered from the trees and brilliantly colored birds took flight as the warship's passage disturbed the usual tranquility. For farm boys from the Midwest and city kids from the East Coast alike, it was an otherworldly experience. Emerging into the Pacific, the KIDD joined a growing armada of American naval power that was steadily pushing Japanese forces back across the vast ocean. The ship was assigned to Task Force 53, providing escort for the fast carriers that would project American air power against Japanese-held islands. It was during these early Pacific operations that Walter Hayes, fresh from engineering school, reported aboard the KIDD. His initial excitement at being assigned to a frontline destroyer was somewhat deflated when he learned of his primary duty, maintaining and operating the ship's ice cream machine. Ice cream? "You're pulling my leg, Chief," Hayes reportedly told the division leader who gave him the assignment. "No joke, Hayes," Chief Petty Officer Merrill replied. "That machine is more important to morale than you know. Half the destroyers in the fleet would kill to have what we've got. You take care of it, and it'll take care of the crew." Hayes found himself assigned to an unusual duty for a destroyer sailor, assisting with the operation and maintenance of the ship's ice cream machine. Typically, ice cream was a luxury reserved for larger vessels like battleships and carriers. The cramped conditions and limited resources of destroyers, nicknamed tin cans for their relatively thin hulls, rarely allowed for such amenities. Yet the KIDD had been one of the first destroyers fitted with an ice cream maker, a point of immense pride among her crew of 300 men. The machine itself was a marvel of compact engineering, installed in a corner of the auxiliary equipment room near the galley. About the size of a small refrigerator, it could produce 5 gallons of ice cream in approximately 45 minutes. Its stainless steel construction gleamed under the compartment's harsh lighting, and its refrigeration compressor emitted a steady, reassuring hum that became part of the ship's background noise. The crew had christened it Captain Kidd's Treasure Chest, a name painted on its side in elaborate script by one of the signalmen who had been a commercial artist in civilian life. "Never thought I'd be making ice cream in the middle of a war," Hayes wrote home in a letter dated October 18, 1944. "But you'd be amazed what it does for morale. Fellows coming off watch in this Pacific heat, 110 degrees in the engine room, nothing lifts their spirits like a scoop of the cold stuff. We only get to make it twice a week due to rationing of milk powder and sugar, but those are the most popular days on ship. Even the captain comes down for his share. The letter didn't mention that Hayes had already become something of a celebrity among the crew. His experiments with the limited ingredients available had resulted in a coconut-flavored ice cream, made from coconuts obtained during a brief stop at a Pacific island, that the sailors declared superior to anything they'd had back home. Even the ship's medical officer had noted in his reports that sick bay visits for heat exhaustion dropped noticeably on days when ice cream was served. What Hayes and his shipmates didn't know was that their humble ice cream machine represented far more than just a morale booster. It was part of a deliberate strategy developed at the highest levels of the U.S. Navy, a strategy that would have psychological implications far beyond their destroyer. The USS KIDD's ice cream machine wasn't just unusual. It was part of a deliberate strategy developed by Navy leadership to boost fighting effectiveness through improved morale. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal had written in an internal memorandum in 1943 that ice cream, in my opinion, has been the most neglected of all the important morale factors. Coming from America's top naval official, this directive opened floodgates of funding and innovation dedicated to solving the seemingly trivial problem of how to provide frozen desserts in a combat zone. What Japanese intelligence officers would later find most baffling wasn't just that America devoted resources to ice cream production during wartime, but that they treated it as a tactical priority rather than an indulgence. The operation of the KIDD's ice cream machine wasn't haphazard. It was scheduled with the same precision as ammunition resupply or fuel replenishment. By the time Walter Hayes joined the KIDD's crew, she had already established a colorful reputation throughout the Pacific Fleet. The KIDD sailors, embracing their pirate persona, had developed a practice of ransoming rescued pilots back to their aircraft carriers in exchange for ice cream mix and other delicacies. While other destroyers performed similar rescues, the KIDD's crew did it with theatrical flair, sometimes flying a makeshift black flag during the transfer to emphasize their piratical demands. This practice wasn't merely playful, it served a practical purpose. By early 1944, supply lines stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific, and even with America's industrial might, keeping smaller vessels supplied with luxuries was challenging. The creative ransom system enabled the KIDD to keep her ice cream machine operational far beyond what standard supply channels would have permitted. Hayes had no idea that his seemingly minor duty would soon intersect with the broader strategic battle for the Pacific, not through combat, but through psychology. The Pacific War of 1944 was unfolding in a way few Japanese strategists had anticipated. The island-hopping campaign devised by Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur was bringing American forces inexorably closer to the Japanese homeland. Major naval battles at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf had decimated Japanese naval power. Yet in Tokyo and at forward command posts throughout the shrinking Japanese empire, many commanders maintained an almost mystical belief in ultimate victory. Their strategy increasingly relied on the concept of spirit overcoming material disadvantages, a philosophy that would reach its tragic conclusion in the kamikaze attacks that the KIDD and other ships would face off Okinawa. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki commanded Japanese naval forces in the defense of Okinawa, maintaining a detailed war diary despite deteriorating conditions. As American forces tightened their grip around Japanese-held territories, Ugaki's diary entries reflected a growing awareness of the material disparities between the opposing forces. On March 15, 1945, Ugaki wrote, "Our men survive on reduced rice rations and struggle for basic ammunition. Reports indicate American sailors complain if ice cream is not available daily. The difference in our conditions has become incomprehensible." Japanese intelligence had been piecing together a picture of American logistics that seemed almost fantastical from their perspective. Radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations revealed that the U.S. Navy operated dedicated ice cream barges in forward areas, floating factories that could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes and store up to 2,000 gallons for distribution to the fleet. More shocking to Japanese commanders was learning that even small destroyers like the KIDD had their own ice cream production facilities. To officers who were watching their own men face starvation, the psychological impact was profound. It wasn't just that America could produce more ships, planes, and bullets. That much had been apparent since Midway. It was the realization that America could fight the war without meaningful sacrifice on the home front, while devoting resources to comfort and morale that Japan could not spare for even basic necessities. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of attacks on Pearl Harbor, later recalled the effect this knowledge had on Japanese officer morale. When we received intelligence about American ice cream ships, many officers refused to believe it. When confirmation came, the impact was devastating. We had been told America was soft, unable to sacrifice. Yet here they were, bringing ice cream to the front lines while our men had no medicine for malaria. It spoke to a level of industrial capacity we could not counter. By early 1945, the USS KIDD had participated in some of the Pacific War's most significant campaigns. She had escorted aircraft carriers during strikes on Wake Island, provided anti-aircraft protection during the invasion of the Philippines, and bombarded enemy positions in the Marshall Islands. Through it all, her ice cream machine kept operating, a small but meaningful comfort in the midst of war's brutality. As preparations for the invasion of Okinawa intensified in February 1945, the KIDD underwent a major overhaul at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. Here, her ice cream machine received upgraded components, a detail so minor it barely warranted mention in the ship's maintenance logs, yet one that would feature prominently in the psychological warfare unfolding across the Pacific. Walter Hayes returned from shore leave to find the newly refurbished machine waiting. "It's twice as efficient now," he wrote home. "Command says morale is a multiplier of combat effectiveness." Never thought making ice cream would be considered essential war work, but here we are. The KIDD rejoined Task Force 58 in March 1945, part of the massive armada assembling for the Okinawa Campaign, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. As American forces approached the island, Japanese defenders prepared for what they knew would be a desperate, likely suicidal defense. On March 23rd, the KIDD took up position as a radar picket ship, one of the destroyers placed on the perimeter of the fleet to provide early warning of incoming air attacks. This dangerous duty put her directly in the path of kamikaze attacks, Japan's desperate tactic of using pilots on one-way suicide missions against American vessels. The morning of April 11, 1945 began like many others for the KIDD's crew. Sailors stood watch, engineers monitored the propulsion systems, and in his small corner of the ship, Walter Hayes prepared the day's ice cream ration. The familiar rhythm of shipboard life continued despite the looming threat of attack. At approximately 10:45 hours, radar operators detected multiple incoming aircraft. As general quarters sounded throughout the ship, Hayes secured his station and raced to his battle position. The air defense teams opened fire with the KIDD's 5-inch guns and numerous anti-aircraft batteries, filling the sky with exploding shells. Despite the ferocity of the KIDD's defense, one Japanese aircraft broke through, crashing into the forward section of the ship. The impact ignited fuel and ammunition, causing catastrophic damage. 38 sailors died instantly, and 55 others suffered serious injuries. In the chaotic hours that followed, the crew fought desperately to save their ship. Damage control teams battled blazing fires while medical personnel treated the wounded. The KIDD managed to remain afloat, but the damage was severe enough that she required immediate withdrawal from the battle area. As the wounded destroyer limped toward the American anchorage at Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs, a strange scene unfolded that would later be documented in several sailors' accounts. With the ship's galley damaged and normal food service interrupted, Hayes and other crew members distributed ice cream from the machine's surviving stock to wounded sailors awaiting medical evacuation. Never saw anything like it. Pharmacist's mate, second-class James Thornton, later recalled men with shrapnel wounds eating ice cream while waiting for treatment. Some smiled through the pain. It was surreal, but somehow perfectly American. Word of this incident spread through the fleet, eventually reaching Japanese intelligence through intercepted communications and prisoner debriefings. The image of wounded American sailors eating ice cream while their ship burned became a powerful symbol of the disparity between the opposing forces. The Japanese kamikaze campaign reached its peak intensity during the Battle of Okinawa, with thousands of aircraft launched against the American fleet. Despite inflicting significant damage and casualties, it failed to turn the tide of battle. Okinawa fell to American forces on June 21, 1945, after 82 days of brutal fighting. Among the Japanese officers observing the battle from the main islands, the psychological impact of America's material advantage had become impossible to ignore. Intelligence reports describing American ice cream ships and destroyers with dedicated ice cream production facilities contributed to a growing sense that Japan could not win a war of attrition against such an adversary. Vice Admiral Ugaki's diary entries from May 1945 reflect this realization. When America can devote ships solely to ice cream production while our pilots fly without sufficient fuel for return, victory through spirit alone seems increasingly an illusion rather than a strategy. The USS KIDD survived her ordeal off Okinawa, undergoing repairs at Ulithi and later at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. Walter Hayes remained with the ship, continuing his unusual duty as the KIDD prepared to rejoin the fleet for what was expected to be the invasion of the Japanese home islands. That invasion never came. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years was finally over. In the aftermath of the conflict, as historians and military analysts sought to understand the factors that contributed to American victory, material superiority naturally topped the list. The United States had outproduced Japan in nearly every category of war materiel: ships, aircraft, ammunition, and fuel. But increasingly, attention turned to the psychological dimension of the conflict. Former Japanese officers interviewed after the war frequently mentioned America's luxury warfare as having a profound impact on their assessment of the strategic situation. The knowledge that American forces could devote resources to comforts like ice cream while Japanese troops faced starvation had undermined their belief in victory through superior fighting spirit. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takada, who had served on the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, remarked during post-war interrogation, "We knew America had more ships and planes, but we believed our spirit would overcome this disadvantage." Learning that even small American destroyers had ice cream machines while our men lacked basic medical supplies, this was when many of us privately accepted defeat was inevitable. The USS KIDD was decommissioned shortly after the war, on June 19, 1946. Walter Hayes returned to Oklahoma, using his GI Bill benefits to study mechanical engineering, a career choice influenced by his unlikely wartime duty. In later years, he would tell his children and grandchildren about his role as an ice cream specialist aboard a destroyer, often to disbelieving laughter until he produced photographs proving his unusual assignment. "People think war is all about guns and bombs," Hayes told an interviewer for a naval historical project in 1985. "But sometimes it's the small comforts that keep men fighting." That ice cream machine was worth its weight in gold for morale. And after the war, we learned it had another purpose, showing the Japanese they couldn't win against a country that could afford to put ice cream makers on destroyers. The strange tale of the KIDD's ice cream machine might have remained a minor footnote in naval history if not for the declassification of Japanese military documents in the 1970s. Historians analyzing these records were surprised by how frequently American ice cream capability was mentioned in strategic assessments, particularly following the Battle of Okinawa. Dr. Eleanor Sandberg, a naval historian specializing in Pacific War logistics, wrote in her 1984 analysis, "The psychological impact of American material abundance cannot be overstated. Japanese commanders were fighting a war of increasing deprivation while observing American forces receiving ice cream at the front lines. This stark disparity in conditions contributed significantly to the collapse of Japanese strategic confidence in 1945. The ice cream machine from the USS KIDD did not survive to the present day. When the destroyer was converted to a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1982, many of her internal components had long since been removed. However, the ship's restoration included a replica of the famous machine based on photographs and technical specifications from the period. Today, visitors to the USS KIDD Veterans Museum can see this replica and learn the unlikely story of how ice cream played a role in psychological warfare during the closing stages of World War II. Museum docents relate the tale of how Japanese commanders, upon learning that even American destroyers had ice cream machines, began to question whether victory through spiritual strength was possible against an adversary with such material abundance. Walter Hayes lived to see the KIDD become a museum ship, attending the dedication ceremony with several of his former shipmates. He stood for a long time before the replica of the machine he had once operated, lost in memories of both tragedy and surprising moments of joy amid war's destruction. "We knew we had it better than most," he told a local newspaper at the dedication. "But we never thought making ice cream was helping win the war. Turns out it was doing just that, not by feeding our boys, but by showing the enemy what they were up against." In the decades following World War II, military planners increasingly recognized the strategic value of morale and psychological factors in warfare. The humble ice cream machines of the Pacific Fleet, once seen as luxuries, were reassessed as components of a psychological warfare campaign that had helped break enemy resolve. A 1952 analysis by the Naval War College concluded the provision of ice cream and similar comforts to forward-deployed forces served dual purposes, maintaining American fighting morale while simultaneously demonstrating to the enemy the futility of competing with American industrial capacity. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders of learning about dedicated ice cream ships cannot be quantified, but appears to have been substantial. The story of the USS KIDD and her ice cream machine underscores a fundamental truth about warfare that extends beyond weaponry and tactics. Wars are fought not just with steel and explosives, but with psychology and perception. The knowledge that American sailors could enjoy ice cream while Japanese forces struggled for basic provisions created a psychological advantage that complemented America's material superiority. In the final assessment, the KIDD's ice cream machine represents more than just an unusual footnote in naval history. It symbolizes how America's industrial might was expressed in both the machinery of war and in the ability to provide comforts that maintained morale and fighting effectiveness. That this same capability had the unintended effect of undermining enemy resolve makes it one of the war's more unlikely psychological weapons. Today, as military forces around the world continue to grapple with the complex relationship between material resources, morale, and fighting effectiveness, the lesson of the KIDD's ice cream machine remains relevant. Sometimes the most powerful statement of national capability isn't found in the largest weapons, but in the smallest comforts provided to those who serve. For Walter Hayes and the other sailors who operated the KIDD's unusual equipment, their duty may have seemed mundane compared to those manning guns or plotting enemy positions. Yet, in their own way, they contributed to victory not just by boosting the morale of their fellow sailors, but by demonstrating to the enemy that America could fight a war without sacrificing the small pleasures that defined its way of life. The USS Kidd now rests permanently in the waters of the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge, preserved as a National Historic Landmark. Visitors who walk her decks and explore her compartments experience a tangible connection to the sailors who served aboard her during those desperate days off Okinawa and throughout the Pacific War. In the small compartment where the replica ice cream machine stands, a placard tells the unlikely story of how this simple device became part of psychological warfare. It reminds us that victory in war depends not just on weapons and tactics, but on the human factors of morale, perception, and resolve. Perhaps the most telling epilogue to this strange chapter in naval history came during the occupation of Japan, when American forces discovered documents from Imperial Japanese Navy intelligence analyzing the American ice cream strategy. These reports concluded that Japan's failure to account for American industrial capacity, exemplified by the ability to provide ice cream to combat vessels, had been a critical miscalculation in their war planning. Admiral Nimitz, upon reading a translation of these documents, reportedly smiled and remarked, "I never thought we'd win the war with ice cream, but I'm not surprised it helped." For the men who served aboard the USS Kidd and other vessels of the Pacific Fleet, ice cream represented a small taste of home amidst the chaos and danger of war. That this simple comfort also served as a psychological weapon against the enemy would have seemed incredible to them at the time. Walter Hayes passed away in 2007 at the age of 81, one of the last survivors of the Kidd's World War II crew. To the end of his life, he remained proud of his unusual wartime duty, keeping a small model of an ice cream machine alongside his combat medals and service ribbons. "We all did our part," he told his grandchildren in his final years. "Some men fired guns, some men plotted courses, some men fixed engines. I made ice cream. And somehow, each of us helped win the war." The next time you enjoy a scoop of ice cream on a hot summer day, remember the sailors of the USS Kidd and the unlikely role this simple pleasure played in one of history's largest conflicts. It stands as a reminder that warfare encompasses more than just weapons and tactics. It includes the full spectrum of human needs, desires, and psychological factors that ultimately determine who prevails and who surrenders. Would you have seen ice cream as a weapon of war? Or would you, like the Japanese commanders who first heard about the Kidd's unusual equipment, have dismissed it as an American extravagance? The answer reveals much about how we understand the complex interplay of material resources, morale, and psychological advantage in warfare. Share this story so others can learn how America's industrial might, expressed through something as simple as ice cream, helped crack the resolve of an enemy who had once believed spirit alone could overcome material disadvantage.